All right, guys, we're going to finish strong here. We're now going to talk about the foreign policy. And again, I do think Peter the Great's foreign policy could still be under the umbrella of Westernization. His number one goal was to gain a warm water port. He wanted access to the seas. He's building a navy. So where does he look? He's going to look towards the Baltic. And at this moment, Sweden was extended throughout war. We already know that Gustavus Adolphus, great, powerful leader in 1648, but after he dies in the Battle of Lutzen, we don't really see any real successful military-minded Swedes any longer. And they want to be, but they're going to fail. And what happens here? We see here is Sweden. That's that. What's that? Would you say peach shade? The yellow is Poland, and then the green is Russia. So Sweden controlled almost all parts of the Baltic coastline. In 1709, the entire hope here is really almost fulfilled. At the Battle of Poltava, the Russian military, they have a smashing victory over the Swedes. Actually, demolished their forces as the Swedes were actually retreating from the Poles after another defeat. And Peter the Great ordered his army just to really attack, and it ultimately demolished the Swedish army, which really allowed the shift of that balance of power. It's going to take a couple more, about a decade, a little bit more than a decade later to finalize this. And this is a little painting of the Battle of Poltava. You see Peter the Great leading the troops there. And in 1721, this is a really first significant European victory treaty for Russia. The Peace of Nystadt is absolutely a significant aspect as Russia gains almost all of this land here, all of this land accord on the the eastern coast of the Baltic, and that becomes the element. Clearly, Sweden is no longer a player in European politics. They're retreating, and Russia begins to expand the concept of the balance of powers. And we're going to see how they really shake up the 18th and 19th centuries a little bit later. And as a result of the Peace of Nystadt, as well as the war overall, we have St. Petersburg. Peter the Great, he really is tired of Moscow. He thinks Moscow is a boring, gaudy city, too Asian for his taste. Really doesn't want to be there at all. He wants to move his entire government to the Baltic, and that's when he moves in. So he hated Moscow, hated the Kremlin, and he ordered in 1703 the building of St. Petersburg. And this is well before they officially had the land. So in 1703, he's bringing in those German and Dutch artisans to build this infrastructure. And by 1721, it really becomes something. Here, I like this painting. It's a romanticized painting. Here's Peter kind of claiming St. Petersburg. He calls it St. Petersburg after himself. The reason he calls it St. Petersburg, it's Germanized. He doesn't want a Russian name. He wants a Germanized name there so that they feel that they're European. So here he is in 1703, well before that. By 1721, it became Peter's window to the west, his seat of power. Here's an early etching of what the palace began to look like. And when you look at it, it looks, again, very European. He's modeling it after most of it. He models most of it after what? Versailles, absolutely. And then Russia becomes officially a two capital state. They have two capital cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. And this is a image of it much later in the 19th century. But I really like it because look how Western that, or 18th, much later in the 18th century, look how Western that looks. You almost see the Capitol building there, right? The dome. not sure which building that is, but again, we just begin to see that. So I do think St. Petersburg is not only a Western style city built and modeled after Versailles. It is Peter's final step of his transformation. All of his life, his entire reign from the 1690s to 1725, was to make Russia a Western state. And with St. Petersburg, he now has his geographic jewel. So how great was Peter the Great? He calls himself the Great because he wins the Great Northern War. But how great is he really? So let's look. It is true. Russia does emerge as a significant European power by the time we get to the outcome of the Great Northern War. There were European countries who now were worried about Russian aggrandizement. That if there's power vacuums, aka Poland, that could create issues within the rest of Western Europe. And we're going to see how they deal with Poland a little bit later. Russia emerged as an absolute Western style monarchy. The Tsar is no longer a outlier. He's no longer seen as those people in Asia. The Tsar now is embraced by royalty. Unfortunately, because of the lack of really economic development that predated Peter, all of the mercantilism, all the military buildup, all the building of St. Petersburg, all of these different elements, it so created so much debt that we're not sure how they're going to pay it off. And that's really going to be an issue. In some ways, from what I understand, historians have talked about that this debt is even worse than Louis XIV's. Russians were really just generally frustrated. Russians didn't they were tired of Peter telling them that they were bad people, that they had bad culture, they were uncouth, uncivilized. They wanted to embrace their traditions. I love this quote that I found a couple years ago by this Russian economist in the 1720s. So this guy is probably an important guy at the time, but he argued that the Tsar pulls uphill with the strength of 10 men. Well, if you did your power map, you know that he's kind of right. Tsar Peter was a man of, I believe he was 6'7" or 6'11", 6'7" or 6'11", of a time in which the average height was in the 5 feet. So he was a giant man, a strong man. So he pulled uphill with the power of 10. But millions of people pulled downhill. The reason this is important is many of the reforms that Peter tried to force upon the Russian people, you're going to see them deteriorate upon Peter's death. Peter did not live long enough to permanently change that paradigm. So those millions of people are going to keep Russia from quote unquote progressing towards Peter's goals. So historians are torn today. There are people who will focus on the Great Northern War and really build up Peter the Great as one of the greatest monarchs in European history. But there's all the other historians that are, especially Russian historians, who are going to see that he was kind of a speed bump of Russian development, that it kind of slowed the Russian development in some ways while quickening the Western development. So I do think it's important that we understand that just because he's called Peter the Great doesn't mean necessarily he's the greatest of all time. And we'll see more about that. We do have a quiz tomorrow, so make sure you're paying attention, guys. Have a great day.